A former Illinois substitute teacher will spend years in prison after she sexually assaulted an 11-year-old student.
You know, you are going to be placed under arrest.
Me?
You're Allie, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And it's going to be for predatory criminal sexual assault.
Allie Bardfield was arrested in April of last year after law enforcement confronted her at her home. We have the latest from the courtroom, including reaction to her sentence being significantly less than what the state was asking for. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. Allie Bardfield is off to prison. When she gets out one day, she will be on the sex offender registry for the rest of her life. Here's video of Bardfield at her sentencing hearing per WAND-TV in Decatur, Illinois. It's about 3 hours south of Chicago. Bardfield admitted she sexually abused an 11-year-old student of hers and even tried to blame that child for what happened in her conversations with police. But the length of time that Bardfield was sentenced to in prison, it's far less than what prosecutors were going for. Before I get to that sentence and what this sex offender had to say in her defense in court during her sentencing hearing, I'll get to that in just a moment. But I want to go back to the day of her arrest last spring. Now, this is body camera video of detectives walking to Bardfield's home, and you can see that she wasn't always truthful to law enforcement. Now, part of this audio is redacted, which is why you'll hear it drop out at times.
Okay.
638.
We can't answer the door right now, but if you'd like to leave a message, do it now.
Hi. Hey, how are you? Hey, is Allie home? Yeah. Okay. Sheriff's Office, and I'm assisting the Mountain Police Department. How many kids are home?
Three.
Three kids? Okay, just you guys and the kids? Okay.
And
Because-
someone else?
Well,
Yeah, it's my brother. My brother.
Is your brother?
Okay.
Okay. So here's the thing. We have a search warrant for the house, okay? You know, you are going to be placed under arrest.
Me?
You're Allie, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And it's going to be for predatory criminal sexual assault to grooming. Okay, so that's why we're here, to take a look, to make sure we gather what we need out of the house, okay?
For what?
Yeah, so I'll talk to you more about it here in a second, okay? As a matter of fact, if you guys want to go in and start doing that...
Can I put the dogs up?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, please.
We're going to have to follow you in, though, just to make sure, okay? You have your phone with you?
One's a German Shepherd, so...
Okay.
So you can see Bardfield is acting confused as to why detectives are at her door, accusing her of sexual abuse and grooming. This is going on at 4:30 in the afternoon on April 3rd, 2024. The day prior, detectives say an 11-year-old came to the police station with his parents saying Bardfield, his 6th grade teacher, sexually assaulted him. Bardfield worked in the Decatur, Illinois school system. She was considered a long-term substitute teacher for a 6th grade class. She gave off that fun teacher vibe being on social media. Here she is on TikTok in a video with a young girl. Hours before her arrest, deputies say the 11-year-old boy did an interview with a specialist. Deputies also collected a sexual assault kit from the victim. Now, court documents say at her front door, Bardfield denied having sex with the boy. The audio is redacted, and at this point, you heard the detective say they had a considerable amount of evidence, including a conversation that Bardfield had. Now, he is likely talking about the conversation that Allie Bardfield had with the boy earlier in the day after his forensic interview, one that police and the parents were listening in on. It was text, it was voice, it was even FaceTime. They say during those conversations, Bardfield talked about birth control and pregnancy. Bardfield also told the boy to delete the text messages, and then they moved to a phone call. During that, Bardfield told the boy that she couldn't get pregnant. And this, again, it's important to note, is a conversation she is having with an 11-year-old child. Police say on March 29th, 2024, Bardfield had the 6th grade student over to her house for what was considered a, quote, play date. The child's mom noticed her son acting differently, though, after the visit. According to police, the mom then checked her son's phone and social media. When they talked more about what happened, he told her that Bardfield sexually assaulted him. Not only did Bardfield reportedly have sex with the boy, she also sent him $700 on Cash App. She bought him headphones that cost more than $400 and sent nude photos to him on Snapchat. Here's the moment Bardfield is led away, and after this, the story gets even more shocking.
And I'm going to talk to her real quick, and she'll be able to talk to you. No, I'll talk to you here about that. So that lady up there is with you.
Oh my God.
No, but listen. With UCFS, it doesn't mean she's taking your kids. Okay?
Make a 95 show us secure out here.
We are going to give you know, how you raise your kids and what goes on.
Oh my God, I'm not here my life.
Sit in the back because I want to be out of the wind and air. And I'm going to have you have a seat in this second vehicle here.
Showing registered 56 and a half, 10,300. OP revoked.
Which seat?
This up, right up here.
Just hope the OP has been served to him.
You good, buddy?
Yep.
So here's the thing, okay? You work at Hosang.
Bardfield then gets into a police vehicle to talk to detectives. The audio from this part of the body camera is redacted, but according to court documents that we have, this is what she said. At first, she denied having sex with the boy. The detective then said that he had seen the nude pictures that she sent him on Snapchat. When asked why she would do that, this teacher in her 30s replied, quote, "He kept asking and asking and asking and wouldn't leave me alone." The document also states that the victim had sent the teacher explicit pictures. In the body camera video, where the audio is redacted, we can see the moments in this police cruiser during this conversation where police appear to be laying out what they have against Allie Bardfield. The text messages, the nude pictures, the fact that they listened to phone calls with the victim and her, and you can see Bardfield's body language of putting her head in her hands. It's notable that Bardfield tries to say this boy made advances on her. At the end of this part of the conversation, Bardfield is asked how she's feeling about what they have been telling her. And she replies, quote, "I have my criminal justice degree. I'm in my master's program. This isn't how I want my life to be. But I didn't want the victim to feel uncomfortable as I felt uncomfortable. But I was trying to act like nothing happened and just be there for him." At the end of the conversation in the police cruiser, police say that Bardfield did threaten to take her own life. She was then handcuffed and taken to the county jail. Before we get back to this episode of On the Case, I need to bring you a Law and Crime legal alert. There are allegations claiming that online apps DraftKings and FanDuel are engineered for addiction. Now, these multi-billion-dollar companies allegedly continue to put profit over safety. Every free bet, every boosted parlay, and every small payout triggers a dopamine rush that creates dependency and turns harmless fun into a detrimental habit. They keep you hooked, chasing impossible wins, and they trap you in a cycle that can lead to significant financial loss and ultimately damage mental health. Our legal sponsors are taking on the online gambling industry to potentially get compensation for all of those impacted. So if you or a loved one has suffered addiction, financial hardship, or mental health issues due to sports betting apps, visit gamblinglawsuit.com/OTC to take a short quiz and check your eligibility to file a claim. Now, from that moment on, Bardfield was held without bond. In August of this year, Bardfield pleaded guilty to sexually assaulting that boy. The state asked for a maximum of 40 years in prison in this plea deal, opposed to the 60 years in prison that she could have faced if she was found guilty at trial. And that leads us to this week, when Bardfield learned her fate. A judge sentenced her to 10 years in prison, which will be served at 85%. That will be followed by a 3-year period of mandatory supervised release. Bardfield will have to serve the rest of her life on the sex offender registry. Bardfield's also being given credit for the 307 days that she has been in jail following her arrest. As part of her guilty plea, she also gave up her right to appeal. Bardfield also addressed the court.
"I'm sorry from the bottom of my heart to the person that I hurt. I wish I could go back in time to change my actions, but I can't. They haunt me every day and never leave my home. I take full responsibility."
There is a lawsuit pending against the Decatur Public School District. The victim and his family are suing the district. They claim what happened is not an isolated incident. Here's what their attorney told me.
What they really, really want to take place, though, is that other kids and other families who may have been a victim of this woman's acts to feel confident that if they come forward, that we can, hold the school district accountable for the lack of supervision that resulted in Ms. Bardfield being able to commit these acts.
And does the family believe that there are more victims of Allie Bardfield?
I can't speak for the family directly. There has been information that has come to light, some of which has been put into the complaint against the school district that leads us to believe that there may be more victims of Miss Bardfield, and there are likely more victims of abuse and harassment by faculty in the Decatur public school system against students.
At the time of her arrest, Bardfield said there weren't more victims in this case. It's important to remember, though, she also said that she hadn't sexually assaulted the boy until she was confronted with evidence that proved that to be a lie. Joining us now is former sex crimes prosecutor Dan Shore. Thank you for taking the time to be with us on Law and Crime. We often talk about cases, sadly, involving teachers and students. And in this case, we just learned within the last probably half hour or so that Allie Bardfield is going to get 10 years in prison. You compare that to the 40 that prosecutors were asking for and the 60 that she could have received, which would have been the max had she gone to trial and found guilty. But 10 years at 85%, what do you make of that decision by the judge?
I think that's consistent with what I've seen in other cases. I'm a former sex crimes prosecutor, and I prosecuted cases involving teachers, and I also I investigate misconduct involving educational institutions and teacher sex abuse. So I think it is consistent. She didn't have a significant criminal record that would have made her get a longer sentence. She wanted to get probation. The judge rejected that. A decade, it's not as long as the prosecution wanted, but that's a long period of time for someone to be incarcerated. And she has to serve 85% of that. She also has to be on post-release supervision for 3 years after that. She has to register as a sex offender for the rest of her life. So this is a significant sentence.
Right, and I think it's important to note that, because I think sometimes when we just look at the numbers on the outside and we think like, well, they were asking for 40 and she only got 10, and then you think like 10 years. I mean, what have you been doing for the last 10 years? I mean, to spend that amount of time in prison, I mean, it shouldn't just be glanced over as not a lot of time in someone's life. They do 85% at Illinois. So you give someone a sentence, but they're only serving 85%. Why is that, as opposed to just saying you're going to serve 8.5 years in prison?
And that's consistent in a lot of other places also. I was a sex crimes prosecutor in New York. That's how people would be sentenced. Often it's to give an incentive that if someone doesn't behave in prison, there's something hanging over them that you can enhance the sentence. So that 85% is usually contingent on them being a model inmate and not causing problems while they're incarcerated. So there would be 85% of 10 years would be 8.5 years. She was also incarcerated for between a year and a half already. So she would get credit for that. So she's probably looking at another 7 years or so. And I think it's also important to consider that she's 34 years old. So that is really the prime years of one's life, your late 30s, early 40s, when she's going to be in prison for that.
Yeah, and I know that she's a mom, and you think of the years that you're going to miss. And I know a lot of people will look at that sentence and be frustrated, but all I'm saying is, the years that someone loses in their life because they're going to be in prison, and for the rest of her life, she's going to be on the sex offender registry. I know she's going to have 3 years supervised release after. This is just based off the sentencing notes that we have coming in. What does that actually entail? Because when you're on the sex offender registry, you're really being monitored for the rest of your life anyway.
Right. The thing is, sometimes you're on the registry, but the question is, how much are you actually being monitored? So the registry will have you on a list that people can see you're a sex offender. Usually there are restrictions about where you can live, where you can work. But often the next question is, but who's monitoring that? Who's looking into that? So having post-release supervision as a sex offender generally means that there'll be some officer who's going to be regularly meeting with her, talking with her, keeping track of what she's doing, if she's working, where she's living. If there's anything that's on the line of violating that officer is supposed to follow up and prevent it. So it's a lot more diligence in terms of enforcing the criteria than someone who doesn't have the post-release supervision.
Often when we see, not just in cases of this nature, but in a lot of cases where someone takes a plea deal or you head to some sentencing hearing, you'll have the victim impact statements. You might have someone speak on the defendant's behalf. The defendant might make a statement. I always find it interesting, though, where even with that statement, the judge takes about what feels like 2 minutes and then releases some prepared remarks. How much of an impact do the things that people say in the courtroom that day actually have on a judge's decision?
I think the most important part of it is often from the victim. So if the victim or the victim's family in that day asks for leniency or asks for a severe punishment, that could be a big factor for a judge. Usually the judge is familiar before the sentencing date and generally what the prosecution and defense is going to ask for. Sometimes they get statements from the victim and the other impact statements beforehand. So I would think most judges go into that day of sentencing knowing what sentence they're going to give. But I've seen victim impact statements that can really be persuasive one way or another because judges aren't bound legally to follow what the victim wants, but often that's a major factor in determining what sanction and sentence to give.
And just looking at this case, and the age of the victim is just so shocking. And we do a lot of shocking stories, but to see an 11-year-old boy, and not that any victim who might be a little older is any less, but an 11-year-old boy is just so young. In a case like this, what does the age of the victim, how does that factor into what a judge decides the punishment's going to be for the person responsible?
Sure. So as you said, any victim of sex abuse faces trauma, and often that's going to severely interfere with their ongoing life in terms of relationships with other people. But we have seen that the younger someone is when they experience sex abuse, the more of a profound impact that may have on them because they haven't had other healthy experiences in their lives. And this is a major formative experience for someone who's younger. So certainly someone who's 16, 17 will still have severe effects from something like this. But someone who's 11, who's just barely starting to interact with people as more than a little kid, to experience sexual abuse by a teacher, someone who's entrusted by their family to take care of them. Here there were play dates that this 11-year-old was going to this teacher's house. That is something that the law generally recognizes as a more severe punishment needed because it's a more severe crime the younger that someone is. Even though all of these cases are horrendous, the younger someone is, the more likely it is to have an even more severe effect on the rest of their lives.
For the prosecution, and it's hard to know what they're feeling in this moment, and I'm sure every prosecutor is different, but if you looked at what seemed like a lot of evidence that they had in this case, they had phone calls, they had text messages, they had a lot of information, they had an incredibly young victim. Those on the outside that didn't have any stake in this, like myself, might say, you had this person dead to rights. You could have gotten them to 60 years in prison. At the end of the day, she's going to get 10 years in prison, and not looking over that still is a significant sentence. When you ask for 40 and you get 10, would you walk away as a prosecutor feeling like maybe we shouldn't have gone the plea deal route and actually taken this to trial?
Well, a lot of it depends also on what they pled guilty to. Do they plead guilty to the top count? And if so, there's often less discretion on the part of the prosecutor to stop a plea agreement. So I don't have an answer for that, but certainly sure. I think a prosecutor is going to view this as a significant conviction and sentence. And sometimes prosecutors ask for even more time because they believe that's right, but they often know that they're not going to get that enhanced sentence when they ask for it, but they may think it's the right thing to do. And also they want to take a tough stand in court. So I think sometimes prosecutors say that even though they know that at the end of the day the judge is not going to grant that. So I would be surprised if the prosecution was too surprised by this sentence.
And when it comes to registering as a sex offender, the day that she gets out of prison, she's on the registry, what does life look like for her?
There's a lot of restrictions. You are restricted in where you can work, where you can live, where you can go. You're restricted from going anywhere where kids can be, so schools, playgrounds, maybe other gathering places. And depending on the community you're in, there may be very small options in terms of where you can go, where you can live. And the other part of that is it's a public record, so people can search for which people in their neighborhood are registered sex offenders. So this is something that for the rest of her life, other people can learn about. And often word spreads very quickly, especially nowadays with social media. So this is something that for the rest of her life, people she knows are probably going to be very aware that she's a registered sex offender, and they're going to find out why. So that's a mark of Cain that she's going to carry for the rest of her life, even after the post-release supervision ends.
I'm not sure what the custody situation is with her kids, but when someone is registered as a sex offender and they have children, and if those kids are still under 18 when she's out of prison, I mean, how does that factor into how much access they could have to those kids?
Usually there's an evaluation after she's released. So as we talked about, she has a 10-year sentence. She's approximately, it sounds like, going to serve 7 more years if you factor in the 85% she has to serve minus the time served. So I assume part of the post-release supervision will be, does she get custody? Who else is available to have custody? If there's another parent or a grandparent or some other family member, who's going to be taking care of the the children during the time that she's incarcerated? They'll probably want to continue that being in charge of them. So I think those are factors that some court's going to have to decide. Probably a family court will have to decide who gets custody when she's released.
And when it comes to, I think back to this case, and we had body camera video of when she was arrested, and then there were police reports talking about how she really victim blamed based off those reports, even though the boy was just 11 years old. In these types of cases that you've prosecuted where you have this teacher who is significantly older than the victim, how common is it that you see them do this victim blaming and not take responsibility? And we don't know, I will say at the time of this recording, what her statement was in court today ahead of her sentence, but as far as what she, on the initial, as she was getting arrested, seemed to do a lot of victim blaming.
It's very common. I've never seen it be successful, but it's very common that people who are caught and don't feel they can deny that there was sexual interactions with someone who is younger, they'll blame the victim. And sometimes that's not because they think they'll be found not guilty for doing that, but they're trying to get a reduced sentence, saying it's a mitigating factor. You see it most commonly when the victim is 16, 17, and the perpetrator says that the younger person initiated the sexual interactions. And that is usually not successful, but especially with an 11-year-old, it's just absurd for someone who's in their 30s to blame an 11-year-old. And also under the law, it's a strict liability crime, which means that if one person's overage and one person's underage and they engage in sex, that's illegal. It doesn't matter what the younger person did in terms of suggesting that they were okay with this, because they are by law incapable of consent. So it is non-consensual regardless of what that younger person said. And again, if they're 11, it's even more absurd to take that as a factor. And
for people who are, or maybe this is the first time they've seen, you and I talk about these cases, and unfortunately we've talked about some difficult ones. And there's always just that question of how this could happen. How does somebody who is in a position of power, like a teacher who is educating young people, end up sexually assaulting, like in this case? And how do you, I guess, make sense of these stories and how these just seem to continue to happen?
Well, I think it's largely about trust and the violation of that trust, that people are often afraid of strangers hurting their children. And most cases I investigate and most cases I've prosecuted involve people who are not strangers, who are in positions of trust. And if you just think about it in general, if you have an 11-year-old who's going over to a 34-year-old woman who's a teacher to spend time with her, there's really not many reasons why a parent would be suspicious of that. That seems like a really safe environment, someone you know, someone you trust, someone who's an educator. And it would just seem unfathomable that that person would sexually take advantage of your 11-year-old son. So I think the people who are in positions of trust and violate that trust and don't have a prior record before, it's really hard for a parent to anticipate that, because parents need other caregivers to help them. And you need to trust people in order to raise your children, because you can't do it all by yourself as a parent. And then if someone violates that trust, it's really hard to anticipate that and stop that.
And I know we talk often about and we did in this interview, kind of the long-lasting impact that this will have on a victim's life, especially someone who is 11 years old. And I think many people might just say, yes, there's going to be trauma in their life. But I mean, specifically, what does the trauma look like for survivors of sexual abuse years in advance after, even when someone's been convicted, there's justice in that sense, but what is the trauma typically that you see in young people who are victims in stories like this?
Sure, well, there are so many factors and every victim is different, but some commonalities I've seen in my work is, one, this is an 11-year-old's introduction to sexual activity. And you think about how everyone, when they're coming of age and they're learning about sex and they're hopefully learning about it in a healthy way and developing just interpersonal skills and healthy relationship skills, to think that at 11 years old, your introduction to this area is being sexually assaulted by a teacher who you trusted, and that's going to impact their relationships probably for the rest of their lives. Hopefully not, but that's certainly something I've seen in my cases. And then the trauma of the physical violation from an adult who one trusted when one was helpless as a young person. Those are things that people carry with them. And I've seen much older people, adults, even elderly people who are still really thinking about and processing sex abuse from when they were kids. And it's tragic. Unfortunately, though, it's very common.
Yeah, and incredibly tragic. Dan Shore, I know that you write about stories like this, and you have a new book out, and it's always great to just let people know about where they can find that.
Sure. So my latest novel is called Open Bar, and it's about sexual misconduct at a university of underage students who are part of a youth sports program. And it's based on my experience as a sexual misconduct investigator and a sex crimes prosecutor. And people can learn more by searching for Open Bar online or following me on Substack. I have a regular column about these issues.
All right, former sex crimes prosecutor Dan Shore. It's always great to have you on Law and Crime. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.